Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Hey everyone, Craig Baird here. Before I begin today's story, I want to take a moment and ask that you check me out on Patreon at www.patreon.com/CanadaEHX. There are several tiers with great benefits, from ad-free content to t-shirts and other cool stuff. And if you're a fan of Canadian History X, make sure you check out my other shows, From John to Justin and Canada, A Yearly Journey. And don't forget, you can also donate directly to the show at www.canadaehx.com. It helps keep this show going. Alright, on with the show. Think about the longest road trip you've ever taken. Chances are, even if it was a long one, it was done in comfort. Air conditioning in the car, plenty of coffee and drinks from stops along the way, maybe a detour or two to see the Wawa Goose or Mac the Moose. Traveling today, even air travel with all its annoyances, is fairly comfortable. Did you ever walk through hundreds of kilometers in the rain, snow, and heat, struggling to find food for your grumbling stomach? Were you forced to take rickety rafts down raging waters where the threat of drowning was around every river bend? Would you risk it all on the off chance you could maybe find gold in the end? I'm Craig Baird, this is Canadian History X, and today we are sick with fever, gold fever. And today I'm sharing the story of the dreamers who had it too. These are the Overlanders. Gold can make people do incredible things. On the mere hope of finding some, humans will travel immense distances through difficult terrain with no guarantee of becoming rich. In the 19th century, the lottery didn't exist, other than finding pay dirt in a gold rush. And while the Klondike is the most famous one in Canada, it's not the only one. In 1856, gold was discovered along the Thompson River in present-day British Columbia, and then was kept secret until 800 ounces of gold was sent to San Francisco for assaying in February 1857. A month later, newspapers reported on the strike, sparking the Fraser River Gold Rush. Within months, 30,000, mostly American gold seekers flooded to the banks of the Fraser River. The population of Fort Victoria doubled almost overnight, much to the chagrin of the Hudson's Bay Company. For decades, the company had enjoyed near absolute power in the region, and it didn't want its fur trading territory overrun by these new arrivals. Many of the miners were from California, whose legendary gold rush was just drying up. The massive influx of Americans led to the creation of the colony of British Columbia, as Britain wanted to prevent the lawlessness of the California goldfields. They also had a concern that if Americans outnumbered British subjects, the United States would annex the territory. To prevent that, the colony of British Columbia was formed in 1858. It should also be mentioned that while the gold rush led to the creation of British Columbia, it was extremely destructive to the indigenous nation of the Fraser River area. Their territory was overrun, hunting grounds depleted, and diseases such as smallpox spread like wildfire. In every story of a gold rush, though, there are those who strike a gold and those who lose everything. More often than not in Canada, it was the First Nations who suffered the most when gold was discovered. And to hear more of this story in detail, check out my sister podcast, Dead Man's Curse. While British colonial powers worried about American annexation, it turned out those Americans weren't staying very long. By the early 1860s, the Fraser River Gold Rush was drying up, and almost on cue, a second gold rush was ready to begin. In their Cariboo Mountains near the Rockies, prospectors who didn't have luck in the gold rush in the south migrated up to the Horsefly River, where a lucky few discovered a gold field in 1861. News traveled quickly among prospectors, and as soon as someone uttered the words Cariboo and gold, hundreds of people began walking north. But this was different. While the first wave of the Cariboo Gold Rush was made up of Americans, the bulk of the prospectors became British and Canadians on account of the American Civil War. Many Americans returned home to take sides and fight in the conflict. Many gave their lives. Prospectors from eastern Canada and elsewhere in the British Empire had finally arrived in British Columbia for the Fraser River gold rush, only to be diverted. And among those prospectors were about 150 people who ventured out from the east to find their fortune. It was a legendary journey, and not all of them survived. Catherine O'Hare Schubert was a 27-year-old when she made a decision with her husband that would change their lives. She was born in 1835 in Ireland during the deathly grip of the potato famine. After a typhus epidemic worsened conditions for her family, Catherine enrolled in a domestic science course offered by the British government, which encouraged young Irish women to move to North America. After completing the program, she left the only home she had ever known and traveled across the Atlantic to work as a domestic servant near Boston, where she learned to read in her spare time. In 1855, she married Augustus Schubert, a carpenter from Germany, and the couple moved to the Minnesota Territory before going farther north to settle in St. Boniface in modern-day Winnipeg. Less than a year later, the Red River burst its banks and took their home and everything they owned with it. Destitute, the family needed a new path forward. Less than a year later, a group of men from Canada West, Canada East, the United States, and the United Kingdom arrived at nearby Fort Garry via the railroad on a journey west to find gold. They were the Overlanders, and Catherine, her husband, and their 3 children linked up with them on their quest for gold. At the helm of the Overlanders was an ambitious man seeking a fortune by the name of Thomas McMicking. Born in 1829 in Stamford Township in Canada West, now Ontario, he was the oldest of 12 children to William and Mary McMicking. He studied at the University of Toronto, and upon graduation, he became a teacher in his hometown. Hoping to move into politics, he ran in the 1861 election as a Clear Grit, a precursor to the Liberal Party, but lost to Conservative John Simpson. With his political path going nowhere, and his salary not giving him high hopes for fame and riches, McMicking's ears perked up when he heard of gold out west. So he organized a party of about 28 men to travel overland from Canada West to the Cariboo region. It was a journey of 3,200 kilometers as the crow flies. In April 1862, he and the Overlanders left Queenston, Canada West for British Columbia. With him was his brother Robert, along with Gilbert, William, and Thomas Rennie, 3 brothers who also wanted to find gold for themselves. As the group traveled west, they came across others who had the same destination in mind. That original group of 28 men under McMicking soon swelled to over 100. The entire group was highly organized, and McMicking began charging a $5 fee to join and travel together. The money was put towards buying supplies for everyone and ensuring the group had what it needed to make the journey safely. And before long, McMicking was chosen officially as leader through a vote, with a council of 13 men to serve as his advisors. McMicking insisted they adopt rules to manage their journey, including how they would behave in camp and on the trail. Schedules, hours of travel, and starting times were all put down on paper. It was believed that being organized would make the trip easier. They also determined what should be done in the case of a First Nations attack. The Overlanders grew up reading sensationalized stories of Indigenous nations attacking settlers. They had no way of knowing that such attacks were extremely rare, especially in Canada. Later, McMicking said that the First Nations they met on their way were helpful, kind, and, in his own words, our best friends. The group reached Detroit by railroad from St. Catharines on April 23rd, where they boarded another train to Grand Haven, Michigan. They then boarded a steamer called Detroit to Milwaukee. This was followed by another train trip, followed by the steamer Frank Steele, until they reached St. Paul, Minnesota, where Eustace Pattison and 18 other Englishmen joined the group. Eustace and his group were hooked into the enterprise weeks earlier by an advertisement in the English newspapers. The British Columbia Overland Transit Company offered, for the small fee of £42, to transport people from England to Canada via boat, then across to Winnipeg on a train. From there, the ad stated it was a simple matter of taking wagons all the way to British Columbia. The company claimed the entire journey could be made in only 5 weeks. As was common for those looking to make money off travelers looking to travel to remote gold fields, they used to portray the rushes and the entire journey as a simple walk through the countryside. The advertisement stated, "This is the speediest, safest, and most economic route to the gold diggings. The land transit is through a lovely country unequaled for its beauty and celebrity of climate. Eustace and the others soon discovered the harsh truth behind the blatant lie. From St. Paul to Georgetown, the group's journey slowed to a crawl because the trip of 257 kilometers could only be made by a stagecoach. The only problem was the stagecoach could only hold no more than 10 people at a time, and the group had ballooned to about 150 men, so the process of transporting them took days. Once reuniting in Georgetown, though, the Overlanders discovered that their steamboat, the International, was still under construction, and they were stuck for days, waiting for it to finish. In Georgetown, McMicking met Alexander Grant Dallas, the governor of Rupert's Land, who was on his way to Fort Garry as well. At the time, Rupert's Land was still under the control of the Hudson's Bay Company. The territory covered 3 million square kilometers of land, stretching from the Rocky Mountains to Nunavut and Labrador. On May 26, though, the group finally reached Fort Garry. The entire trip from St. Catharines to Fort Garry had taken over a month, the same amount of time the British advertisement stated the journey to the Cariboo would take. And they weren't even halfway there. Getting to Fort Garry was easy, compared to what happened next. And it is here where Catherine and Augustus re-enter our story. Like so many others with gold fever, Augustus was enchanted by the stories of striking it rich out west, and having lost everything, he wanted to seek his fortune. Catherine, though, was not about to let him go alone and insisted the entire family join him. One of the rules that McMicking and the Overlanders had adopted early on was that no women were allowed. I don't know why this rule was in place, but it was likely because the men didn't believe a woman could make such a long journey. They'd obviously never heard of the amazing Charlotte Small, wife of David Thompson. Be sure to check out my episode on that amazing woman from 2023. Like Charlotte Small, Catherine was determined, and she wasn't going to be left behind, so the Overlanders had to make an exception. She did leave out that she was pregnant with her 4th child, believing they would be at the Cariboo goldfields before the child arrived. As they left Fort Garry never to return, Catherine rode a horse with her children, Gus and Mary Jane, and saddle baskets on either side. Augustus carried the youngest child, Jimmy, as he walked beside the horse. They covered 1,600 kilometers to Fort Edmonton through heavy rain, deep mud, and with mosquitoes tormenting them constantly. Every morning they woke up at 2:30 a.m. and left camp at 3 a.m., then traveled until breakfast at 5 a.m., then break for 2 hours, then more traveling until lunch from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., then traveled till 5 p.m. when evening break began. As they journeyed, they created an immense line of over 150 people, 97 carts, and 110 animals extending for 1 kilometer. They rested on Sundays, reserving the day for singing hymns, praying, and listening to scriptures. Later in the trip, this would be abandoned as the desire to end their traveling torment overwhelmed any spirituality. Along the way, the group was quick to discover that, after Fort Garry, there were no bridge crossings over rivers. And this was by design. The Hudson's Bay Company wanted to limit settlers on their fur trading lands. Travel without bridges was difficult, and few settlers went further than present-day Manitoba. If you've ever played Oregon Trail, you know that fording a river can end in success just as easily as it can end in failure. The Overlanders often risked fording rivers, and when they could, they rented a ferry at various spots along the rivers. These ferries could only take a few people and animals at a time, further delaying their endless march west. Some of these small ferries had to cross 100 times and over 6 hours to get the entire group to the other side. From Fort Garry to near present-day Saskatchewan-Manitoba border, the Overlanders were aided by a guide. But on June 18th, they woke up to find their guide gone and the land covered in frost. It was not a welcome sight. On June 25th, they left the forests of Manitoba and entered the vast prairies of what is now Saskatchewan and Alberta. This is when the group's discipline began to break down. Some hurried to the front to cross rivers first so they could continue on ahead, which angered everyone behind them. Tempers flared and quarrels were more common. Nearly everyone had expected to be in the Cariboo country by now, but they were still hundreds of kilometers away. McMicking did his best to keep the group together, always pressing forward and using his charisma and leadership to keep everybody in line. On June 30th, they reached the South Saskatchewan River, the largest river they had faced so far, but on the other side were the Hudson's Bay Company ferry. A.C. Robertson, who was the best swimmer in the group, volunteered to jump in the water and cross the river to get the ferry. He succeeded, and for hours the group slowly transported everyone, including their carts and animals. Now in modern-day Alberta near Fort Pitt, the group separated into 4 smaller groups that traveled close together. McMicking was given the rank of colonel of the entire group, while others like A.C. Robertson were named captains of the smaller ones. This helped to repair nerves, as those who wanted to move faster could join a fast group, while slower travelers didn't have to rush to keep up. They also hired a guide to find their way to Fort Edmonton. Unfortunately, almost as soon as this agreement was reached, the rains started. For 11 days, rain came down and soaked everything and everyone, and at one point on July 12th, it rained so hard, no Overlander could journey that day. McMicking did what he could to keep the spirits up. He formed a musical society that had violinists, flautists, and vocalists. Even during those rainy days, the orchestra did what it could to entertain everyone. The rain also caused rivers to become raging beasts. Fording and ferries were out of the question. From July 18th to 20th, 8 bridges were built. Some were only 12 meters long, while others were upwards of 30 meters. When wood could be found, it was used for bridges, but at one point the carts were put into the water to form a bridge across a small river to walk across, and several carts were lost in the process. On July 21st, 1862, the party reached Fort Edmonton. This was the last place to top up supplies before British Columbia. McMicking wrote, "During the preceding 11 days, our clothing had never been dry. We had just passed through what can be considered a pretty rough time, and the toil-worn, jaded, forlorn, and tattered appearances of the company was in striking and amusing contrast with our appearance a few months before." For 8 days in Fort Edmonton, the party gathered what they needed. The men in Fort Edmonton were happy to see the Overlanders, having been cut off from the rest of the world for months. They also told the group that they had to leave their carts behind because only pack horses could be used to navigate through the mountains. Overlander Archibald Thompson panned for gold outside Fort Edmonton and told the group that he had found some gold and convinced some to remain rather than continue their journey. "I've lived near Edmonton most of my life. I can promise you, there is no gold in that river." It's likely Archibald found fool's gold. Nonetheless, several men decided to stay at Fort Edmonton to pan for gold that they would never find. But at least they saved themselves weeks of torment on the trail to the Cariboo country. McMicking took pack animals and the group began their long journey to the Rocky Mountains. At one point west of Fort Edmonton, a man named Tim Love came across the group and shared with them that he found immense gold riches on the eastern slopes of the Rockies. Nothing more than a con man, he convinced 25 men to follow him. None found a single ounce of gold. The others continued towards the Yellowhead Pass. They were aided by a Métis guide they had hired named Andre Cardinal, who guided them through the incredibly difficult terrain, as the forests were so thick they had to chop a path to forge forward. And despite it being August, the weather in the morning was cold and dew froze on leaves. Sometimes the group had to swim across frigid rivers when a bridge could not be built, and with each passing kilometer, more items were discarded to lighten the heavy loads. For years afterwards, rusting bits of metal could be found along the path the Overlanders took. To make matters worse, each person was getting weaker due to a depleting supply of food. There was a brief respite of the misery on August 13th when the Overlanders saw the Rocky Mountains for the first time. McMicking wrote, "A view at once sublimely grand and overpowering." There are 3 main passes into the Rocky Mountains. In the far south, where the Frank Slide occurred, is the Crow's Nest Pass, rising to 1,130 meters. If you're unfamiliar with the Frank Slide, make sure you listen to my episode from 2023 about that terrible disaster. Farther north, near present-day Banff, there is the Kicking Horse Pass, which rises to about 1,600 meters and is where the Transcontinental Railway and the Trans-Canada Highway were built. Then there's the Yellowhead Pass, which has the lowest elevation, but that doesn't mean it's easier. For one thing, the path was extremely narrow and several horses fell to their deaths after they lost their footing. One pack horse fell off the path and plummeted 121 meters. Amazingly, the horse was unharmed and hauled back up to the path, but 2 others that slid off at the same spot were not so lucky. On August 22nd, the Overlanders crossed over the Continental Divide and entered British Columbia. They'd expected the whole journey to take 2 months. They'd been walking for 3 and still were not in the Cariboo. They were nearly out of food, so the Overlanders resorted to killing some of their oxen and horses. Others shot anything they could find, including small birds and squirrels. Pack animals that were not eaten were near the end of their ropes. Some fell on the path dead from lack of food and exhaustion, while others crossed rivers, only to be swept away. One horse lost in the river took all of the party's cooking utensils with it. But then, when things were at their most dire, the Shuswap people appeared and brought them berries and fish, which the Overlanders gladly traded ammunition and clothing for. Catherine and Augustus, with their 3 children strapped to their backs, had also made the journey so far. Alexander Fortune, one of the men in the party, stated that Catherine was a brave and devoted mother, and her presence among the dozens of men created a kind atmosphere and disagreements were few and far between. Catherine and her children also helped convince First Nations that the group was peaceful, not looking to start a war by entering their territory without permission. And having filled their bellies, the Overlanders were at a crossroads. Literally. To head in the Cariboo goldfields, there were 2 options. One was to go north to Fort George, present-day Prince George, and then down to Quesnel along the Fraser River. The other option was to journey down the North Thompson River, south towards Fort Kamloops. A meeting was held on September 1st, 1862, and it was decided that everyone would go their own way. McMicking led the group heading towards Fort George and Quesnel on the Fraser River. To make the journey, they built rafts to navigate the turbulent river. On a raft with 32 men, which McMicking named for his hometown of Queenston, he ventured down the Fraser River. There were several other rafts with him, all hoping they would survive the journey. Eustace Pattison took a canoe and reached the Grand Canyon of the Fraser River a full 2 days ahead of everyone else. There was no way that the canoe could handle the rapids ahead, so Pattison and the 2 others attached a rope to the front of the canoe and tried to align it up with the river bank. It didn't take long for the rope to snap and the canoe disappeared into the rapids with all of their supplies. The 3 men sat waiting for the rest of the group to arrive, shivering in the cold, with no food and nothing to keep them warm. 2 days later, A.C. Robertson, the strong swimmer with the Overlanders and a right-hand man to McMicking, arrived with his own canoe connected to another by a rope. As they hit the rapids, the water tore the 2 canoes apart. Robertson and the 2 men with him were thrown into the river. He called out to the men to hold onto a canoe stuck on rocks while he swam to shore to get help. And as soon as he attempted to swim away from the canoes, the river took him. His body was never found. Thankfully, McMicking appeared on his large raft and rescued the men in the water. Soon after, they reached Pattison and the 2 men with him, who were still waiting on shore. To minimize the risk to everyone in the rapids, it was decided 10 men would stay on his raft while the others walked on shore. McMicking wrote, "Onward they sped like an arrow. They seemed to be rushing into the very jaws of death." McMicking's raft, and the rafts of the others who followed him, did make it through the rapids and the rough waters ahead. On September 8th, McMicking and his group reached Fort George. By this point, the young Eustace Pattison was suffering from diphtheria. The 2 days he spent waiting with no supplies or dry clothing had severely weakened him. That night he died and was buried outside Fort George, never having reached the gold fields. On September 11, 1862, McMicking and his group reached Quesnel Mouth, located at present-day Quesnel, British Columbia. McMicking attempted to reach Williams Creek to begin mining, but it was too late in the season, and he was hearing discouraging reports from other miners who were turning back towards the Pacific coast. The journey, for this part of the Overlanders, was over. It appeared the entire trip had been for nothing. Augustus and Catherine, though, chose the southern route towards Fort Kamloops on the North Thompson River, and for them, there were still many kilometers to come. In the group of Augustus and Catherine, there were 32 people and 100 horses and cattle. The journey south was extremely difficult, despite it being a shorter distance. At one point, all their provisions and baggage were lost in the rapids on the North Thompson River. At the narrow part of the river named Hell's Pass, not to be confused with the even more treacherous Hell's Pass farther south on the Fraser River, most of the remaining rafts were destroyed. From this point on, the group had to walk. Most of their food was gone, and to fill their stomachs they ate edible plants wherever they could. They came upon a deserted indigenous village, where corpses littered throughout, all victims of the deadly smallpox epidemics that swept through during the gold rushes. The group continued on until they reached Fort Kamloops, near the end of their ropes, on October 13th. 1 day later, with the help of an indigenous woman, Catherine gave birth to her 4th child. Named Rose, she is believed to be the first white girl born in the interior of British Columbia. A Mr. DeWitt, who was with the group, stated, "The poor woman was here confined and presented her husband with a fine little girl, much to the surprise of many of the party. McMicking later heaped praise on Catherine in his journal, stating, "In performing this journey, Mrs. Schubert has accomplished a task to which but few women are equal, and with the additional care of 3 small children, one which but few men could have the courage to undertake." By the time the Overlanders arrived at their destinations in the fall of 1862, the best gold deposits were taken, and others were nearly exhausted. Most of the Overlanders left the country in the spring of 1863, having never mined for gold. Thomas McMicking may have never found fortune, but he did find a new home. He briefly worked in a shingle mill. He then wrote a narrative of his journey that was published in the British Columbian, the newspaper in town, in a series of articles from November 29, 1862 to January 23, 1863. In 1864, he was appointed the town clerk for New Westminster and became the deputy sheriff 2 years later. On June 26, 1866, he organized a home guard due to the Fenian raids occurring in eastern Canada. The Fenian Brotherhood were part of a movement to secure Ireland's independence from Britain. From the United States, the Fenians attacked Canada in the early 1860s in the hopes of diverting resources from Britain to Canada to aid the Irish cause across the Atlantic. The raids never went farther west than the Great Lakes, but nonetheless, McMicking became a first lieutenant in the Home Guard. But sadly, his story was cut far too short. On August 25, 1866, he was visiting a friend in New Westminster when his 6-year-old son, William, fell into the Fraser River. McMicking dove in to rescue his son, but was swept away in the water. Both lost their lives. But what happened to Augustus and Catherine? Augustus and Catherine Schubert remained in British Columbia, where 2 other children, Charles and Nora, were born. Catherine ran an inn and restaurant while Augustus panned for gold. He didn't have much success, but Catherine became a staple of the local community of Lillooet. She taught local children to read and assisted in midwifery in the region. Eventually, in 1881, the family built a school on their property and hired a teacher, and that's where they remained for decades, until tragedy struck. While working in 1908, Augustus fell off a ladder and died. Catherine sold the farm and moved to Armstrong, British Columbia, where she remained until her own death in 1918. Today, a memorial honors the Schubert family in Armstrong, which states that they were brave and notable pioneers. There's also a statue in Kamloops of Augustus and Catherine with their children, and Schubert Drive in the city is named for them. I hope you enjoyed that episode and our look at the Overlanders of 1862. Next week, we're looking at the story of Igor Gozenko. This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories. And there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com, or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.